You're listening to episode 95 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Britta Hoelzel speaks with us about her recent paper about the potential mechanisms of mindfulness. What are the mechanisms of a mindfulness state? A recent paper suggests, as a starting point of discussion, that 4 significant components may be attention regulation, body awareness, emotion regulation, and sense of self. As we look at the positive benefits of meditation, it is valuable for us to hypothesize about these qualities of the process, as that can help us think creatively about new areas for scientific investigation. Britta Hoelzel, Ph.D., is a research fellow at Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and the University of Gießen in Germany. She received her M.A. in psychology from Frankfurt University and her Ph.D. from Gießen University. She conducts MRI research to investigate the neural mechanisms of mindfulness practice. Her research focuses on the effects of mindfulness practice on attention and emotion regulation, as well as on structural changes in the brain. She is a mindfulness-based stress reduction instructor, a certified yoga teacher, and has been a dedicated yoga and meditation practitioner for the last 12 years. Recently, she has been involved in projects to adapt mindfulness-based interventions for patients with bipolar disorder. At the end of this interview, Britta references a brand new study of a colleague, Tim Gard. I'm happy to say that Tim's work has just been published, and our interview with him about that will be next week's episode. And on a personal note, I would like to thank our friends in the scientific community for their spirit of collaboration. It is solely due to their open communication and interest that this podcast is able to share their fascinating work in as timely a fashion as we've enjoyed. So, Britta, Tim, Catherine, Sarah, Kathy, Cliff, Fadl, Philippe, and happily everyone else too numerous to mention by name, thank you for sharing. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice chocolate safari tea. Our guest today is Dr. Britta Hoelzel. Britta, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Hi.
We are talking about a paper that recently came out. You're with Mass General Hospital Departments of Psychiatry, the Division of Psychiatric Neuroscience. And the paper that you're the lead author on is called How Does Mindfulness Meditation Work? Proposing Mechanisms of Action from a Conceptual and Neural Perspective. So I want us to talk about that. Before we go into it, though, I'd like you to tell us about your background, which is a little different from many of the guests I've had today, and how your interest in meditation started and how that intersected with science.
Yeah. So I got interested in meditation through my own personal yoga practice. I started practicing yoga while traveling in India after finishing high school. And I found that it was such a helpful practice for me, and it really helped me enhance the awareness that I brought into the day. So I felt it helped me gain more, yeah, conscious awareness of what was going on around me and within me. So a tool of looking at the way my mind works. And I was really interested in learning about what it means to be human, or what the human mind and psyche works like. So I got curious in that, and that also motivated me to start my psychology studies. So that was in Germany. I went to university in Germany to study psychology. And then it was not until after my master's in psychology that I came into meditation research, because I felt I wanted to bring these two areas of interest of mine together and actually bring the science to the meditation and have them both mutually influence or enrich each other. I just found that it was such a pity that Western psychology was hardly taking notice of yoga and meditation practices and all these practices that had long been developed to learn about how we have tools for ourselves to enhance our well-being and our quality of life. So I thought this would be an interesting way of bringing them together.
That is you said it exactly right, and that's one of the things that's very exciting now about our practice is that there is valid scientific evidence to show that this isn't simply self-reporting placebo effect kinds of things, and it's this again. And Sarah is the one who actually corrected me on this. It's not to dismiss the placebo effect when we're talking about psychological issues.
Uh-huh.
That's actually very helpful.
It is,
So
it is very interesting too.
yeah, very. And in fact, I want to do a separate episode entirely on that and some of the benefits because our skeptic community, and I come from a skeptic background, tends to use placebo in a very dismissive fashion without looking at, but wait, there are situations where there's therapeutic benefits to having that. So we need to look at what do we actually mean by placebo. Do people feel better? Yes. Isn't that our objective? Oh, yeah, kind of. So, you've been working with our friend Sarah Lazar. We interviewed, for people who are listening to the podcast, we interviewed Sarah in episode 50 about the study Mindfulness Practice Leads to Increase in Regional Brain Gray Matter Density. That was your study. Tell us a little bit about that. You've been working with Sarah since 2008, I think?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, so we did the study to look at changes that would occur due to meditation practice. There were a small number of studies out there that had investigated experienced meditators and compared them to people who had never meditated before and looked at the structure of the brain of these two different groups and had described yeah, areas of differences in the brains between the two groups. But we were never really able to say, well, this is because of the meditation practice. This is attributable to the meditation practice, because those were just groups of people that were existing. So it was not an intervention.
You didn't
That
have a control. Yeah, yeah.
Right, so it was not a pre-post study, but it was just people who had been meditating for a really long time. So it's always possible that people came into the meditation practice with different brain structure to begin.
Right, right.
So we wondered, is it really something that you would be observing over time? And can it be observed? Can changes in the brain structure be found as a result of meditation practice over 8 weeks? And what we did was we recruited participants and had them go into the MRI scanner for us. So we took high resolution pictures of the structure of their brains. And then we brought them into an 8 week mindfulness based stress reduction program. So they underwent this class, and then we scanned them again right after the class. And we looked at the changes in the brain that happened due to these 8 weeks of practice and compared those changes to a waitlist control group. That's a group of people who were also scanned twice, but they did not receive any meditation training in between. And we found some interesting structural changes in some parts of the brain.
It's always nice to see studies that do have a control so that this isn't just assertions that people are making without any evidence behind them. We have scans of the brain showing a difference between before and
Yeah,
after and a control to compare that against.
that's right. So this was a study with just a waitlist control group, which is nice because we can control for the fluctuations, the naturally occurring fluctuations in the brain. What we cannot control for is this group intervention as a whole. So what we need to do in the future is to find active control groups, find groups that also go through an 8-week group program where they have a social interaction, they have an interaction with the teacher, in order to control for these effects that are not related to mindfulness practice per se, but that might just be effects of the MBSR class other than mindfulness practice. So that's what we'll have to do in the future. And then I also want to say we we were really right at the beginning of all this research. We don't know that much yet. We have seen that there are some structural changes in the brain, some functional changes, but what does that really mean? And studies are beginning to look at what that relates to in everyday behavior or in the subjective experience of the person. But that's something that we just need to get into more in the future to really relate these structural changes or functional changes in the brain to actual real life behavior.
But it's good to hear that that's something that you're aware of. Well, how do we know that it's actually meditation and not the group dynamics or something like that going on?
Yeah, I think that's there's definitely, of course, an agreement in the field that that's what we'll need in the future, and that's what we're going to be looking at. And in fact, we have just completed, or I'm just analyzing data from a study where we did use an active control group. That was it was a group that was developed to really control for all the unspecific effects of the meditation practice that my colleague Elizabeth Hoagie here at MGH has developed.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. Well, let's talk about the new paper that just came out, and tell us a little bit about what the goal of this work is and what you were interested in showing. Something about mindfulness not being a single skill.
Yeah, so the idea was, well, my motivation was to get some more structure or clarity into what we have learned so far. And I mostly did that because I wanted some clarity. We have so much research out there. There are all these bits and pieces there, and I did not get the full picture. And of course, we're still far away from getting the full picture, but I thought it could be helpful to get some order, some structure, some systematic into this. And so I try to think about what are really some fields that you can summarize these findings into. So some mechanisms that seem to be underlying these positive benefits. So it was about finding why does mindfulness meditation seem to work so well for so many different disorders and in so many different areas. It seems quite puzzling that we've found in the literature that it seems to have a very broad effect on so many different disorders, and it enhances people's well-being and has positive effects on physiological measures. So I thought maybe we can find some components, some mechanisms that might be underlying this effect of mindfulness meditation. So I really wanted to understand more, how can we structure this better? How can we summarize it? How can we integrate it into one picture? And I was hoping to try to keep some of the complexity, and that's how I came up with these different components, while at the same time fitting them all together into one model that could describe of actually what is happening when people experience a mindful state, and when they experience difficult situations also and encounter them with mindfulness, how would that work? So we came up with these four components that I feel at this current point in time describe much of the mechanisms. And I say much very deliberately because I don't think it describes all of it. And there's so much more. And this is just the very first step. And this was not meant to be a comprehensive review of the literature, but it was just meant as a beginning to discuss more on a theoretical level. How does it work? How can we conceptualize it?
So what components did you find as being part of this that you measured, and how did you go about distinguishing them? There are four different components, yes?
Right. So the components that we've described there was the first component being attention regulation. And that's probably the component where we have the most empirical evidence that mindfulness practice influences attention regulation capacities. So that's the first area. And then the second is a body awareness. And I think that's a very important component of many of the mechanisms, and it has not been investigated that much yet. But there are some studies that, mostly self-report studies, say that meditators very frequently report that they experience that they have a better awareness of what's going on internally in their bodies, also in their minds. So it's more of an internal awareness, maybe if you want to have it broader. Um, but I think that that's a big part of why mindfulness meditation works so well, is that it helps us be better aware of what's going on inside us. And that's a very crucial mechanism of improvement also, because when we can be aware better of what's going on inside us, we also learn better of what's good for us. We learn more of what situations make us feel what way, and we have a better tool to describe internally or be aware of what emotions are present, what states are present. So that's the second component. And then the third component is really, I think at this point we could split it up into two. It's emotion regulation. And there are different aspects of emotion regulation that have been described to be impacted by mindfulness practice. One is a reappraisal. So it has been described that mindfulness practice helps us reappraise difficult emotional situations in a different way. So reframe them into something that's less threatening, or to see more of the positive or beneficial aspects of a situation, to relate to it in a different way. So that might be one component that has been described in the literature. There's currently a lot of discussion going on about, is it really reappraisal? Is it like a cognitive reinterpretation of emotional situations? Because it seems it's actually not, because with mindfulness we want to be aware of whatever is present in the moment. We don't want to reframe it, or we don't want to give difficult emotions a different name. We just want to relate to them differently.
Right. We want to see them as they are rather than um, rather than changing the changes at a different level.
Right. And that leads us to the next aspect of this, which I am very interested in, and in fact we're actually currently doing research on that, and that is um, the idea that mindfulness really is a situation of full exposure to the situation that we're encountering. And by it being a situation of full exposure, it leads to extinction processes. And I don't know how much these terms are easy to understand. The idea is that it could work very similar to something that we know from behavioral therapy, where the idea is, and that's best known for anxiety disorders, anxiety responses, that if we have a fear response, an anxiety response, um, much of why it's being held up for anxiety patients is that they do not expose themselves fully to the emotion, fully to the situation that they're experiencing, but they're often avoidance strategies, external or internal, and I think we can all relate to that.
Absolutely.
We really don't want to feel this difficult emotion. So it's much easier to turn away, to just bring ourselves into a different situation, or to internally to turn away from it. And that for a short period of time, it gives us some amelioration of the fear of the unpleasant sensations, but it's not the solution to the problem. So behavioral psychology has described how if we actually expose ourselves to the situation and do not turn away from it, that we then give this fear reaction the chance to diminish, to fade off, because that's what it naturally does. We'll naturally habituate to the situation. And I think that mindfulness, a very important mechanism might be, and we haven't really tested that, but it's just an idea at this point of that, and several authors have described that, and I think several people are also following this idea right now, that it really work is a lot of the positive benefits related to the fact that we are exposing ourselves to the emotions. We accept them the way they are. We are with them. We can fully experience them, but then we also learn to let go. Once it's disappearing, we let go. We don't hold on to it longer than necessary, but we just let it take its natural fate and pass away. And so the mindfulness practice actually brings us into a situation where we are able to experience different emotions because we're open for a new experience the moment we have let go. And so we're in a more natural state where we can experience the natural fluctuations of emotions. And I think that that's a big mechanism, not only for anxiety disorders and why mindfulness works so well with anxiety, but also for others, like depression might be an aspect of that too, or actually also just positive emotions. We're just more in fluctuation and more able to let go and to experience what's next.
It's interesting as you're speaking in very contemporary scientific therapeutic terms about our mindfulness practice, and you're referring to them as attention regulation, body awareness, and emotion regulation, and sense of self, those four components. With a background that is more traditional, of course, I see that this is precisely what our practice is, that we have the attention regulation, just the awareness of what's going on moment by moment. Body awareness, I'm breathing, or if there is a particular response I'm having, and it's, say, an anxiety response to something going on, there are physical components to that. I can feel tension in my body. I can feel my heart is racing. So there's the body awareness component. The emotion regulation, well, there's my mental state is such, and that observation, again, that attention regulation, these all are interrelated as you're speaking, which is what you were looking for here.
Yeah, exactly.
And then that sense of self component, and to me, this is also, I agree with you, I think this is one of the most key players in that interplay, is that, and a lot of, I know at least narrative therapy is based on this, is helping people to separate out those physical, emotional, mental responses, those activities from themselves, that they are not those things. They don't need to identify with the story, with the narrative that's going on, but just observe those and tease out and get a little distance from those in the present moment. And that helps with the letting go and being able to experience something other than the anxiety response that they're having. So that sense of self, are like, oh, I'm not these thoughts. I don't have to be carried away by them. Not even necessarily on a cognitive level, but just at a very basic physical body emotion response level. separating that out is so important. And are you seeing this as one of the new perspectives that's for mindfulness practice that's opening up in therapy interventions for patients? Is that something that is a possible outcome of this?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I want to say this was a really nice summary, actually, of what I meant to say. Well said. So your question is, can we bring this more? Can we use this more in psychotherapy? This model also to.
Yeah, is that something that I know psychotherapy has had, is with evolution. We have tailbones and belly buttons and appendices and all these extra things that are part of evolutionary. We use the tools that are there as we go into the next step. And our practices are memes, a nod to Richard Dawkins inventing the term and Sue Blackmore's meme machine. These things they also evolve, they also change, but they are also made up of some base components. And
Mhm.
therapy is no different. It has some holdovers from its past, as does our meditation practice. And so we're now seeing an intersection of those, and maybe more openness in Western therapeutic modalities to look at some of these practices that they otherwise in the past may not have been looking at because they weren't part of the initial makeup of therapy.
Mhm. Yeah.
So do you see some possible openings there? Are you seeing a little more interest in that?
Yes, I think that's well, I think this is happening right now that psychotherapy is opening very much to mindfulness practice and these types of practices. And I think that it will naturally, I trust that it will naturally happen that those components, those aspects of the practice that are useful will survive and those that aren't won't. But yeah, I think it's a nice way of putting it.
Anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Uh, there's actually something that I just came to my mind that I could speak about if you'd like me to.
Please, yes, yes, yes.
And then it's actually a really very recent study that was accepted literally 3 days ago. For
Oh, tell us about the. So
it
tell
is.
us about this new study.
So my colleague Tim Gard just has just published or is just publishing a paper where he looked at the effects of mindfulness on the processing of pain in experienced meditators. And it's a really interesting study, and his findings are really interesting. So, what he did was, and this was a study that we did together in Germany. He's the first author on this, it's his PhD project. He looked at experienced mindfulness meditators and compared them to non meditators and brought people into the MRI scanner. And while they're in the scanner, he applied very unpleasant electric stimulations to their forearms. And he had them go, so the meditators, but also the people who were non meditators, had them go into a state of mindfulness, so practice mindfulness meditation. He explained the non meditators how to do that. And then he had people in a mindful state and compared that to a baseline state, a non mindfulness state, and looked at how this painful stimulus was processed differently when experienced mindfulness meditators were in a state of mindfulness. And what he found was really interesting. He found that there was, so first of all, there was a decrease in the unpleasantness and the self reported unpleasantness of the stimuli. Experienced meditators find these painful stimuli less unpleasant, they bother them less when they are in a state of mindfulness. I think that's something that we meditators can relate to. The stimulus might be just as intense, the sensory experience might be just as intense, but it's not perceived as so unpleasant. we can relate to it differently. What he found in the brain was something that really corresponded well also with what we experience as meditators. He found that there was a high, despite the fact that the painful stimulus was perceived as less unpleasant, he found that the sensory representation of it, so sensory areas in the brain, were highly active. And that's something that's surprising because usually when you have a reduction of a pain experience, you usually see that the sensory component of that in the brain in neuroimaging is also reduced. He did not see that. He saw that the sensory areas in the brain were actually very active. At the same time, he saw that some cognitive areas in the brain, so some prefrontal areas, were less activated in the mindfulness encountering of the pain. And that is also that is atypical because usually people downregulate actively the perception of the pain. So they talk themselves out of the experience, or they have sort of a cognitive regulation of it. That's what you typically see in studies where people learn to regulate pain. So this was quite an atypical pattern in the brain, but it makes sense if you relate it to what people perceive during mindfulness, and that we really tune into the sensory experience, but we do not judge it. We do not cognitively control the experience. We're just experiencing. We're just really being there with the experience as it is. So I thought it was really neat that, and this has been shown by other groups in a very similar way, that the brain really, like Joshua Grant did a very similar study as well, and where we see that the brain really, really corresponds well with what we experience subjectively as meditators when we're in those moments of painful processing.
It's interesting hearing you speak about this, and I think Tim's paper is pain mitigation through mindfulness is associated with decreased cognitive control and increased sensory processing in the brain.
That's right.
For cerebral cortex. I'll be reaching out to Tim to see if we can get him to speak with us about that. It sounds very much like our interview with Fadl Zaidan and John McAfee.
Oh, well, okay, then you got that covered, I guess.
I get it, but it sounds like what Tim has found is an additional part to that I'm not sure Fadl and John addressed in their interview. It was episode 60. We talked to them in April when that came out, and that was a fascinating study because it showed that, yeah, you're still feeling the pain. It's how we relate to it. And those of us who have, and unfortunately I'm raising my hand again, chronic pain issues, and many of the listeners of the podcast are in that same boat, we do know and have experienced that when we have a meditative practice, that our relationship to the pain is different. We do still feel it, but and how to describe this is a little odd, but it doesn't hurt as much. Well, that work that you just described that Tim is doing and that Fadl and John and others are doing shows that, yeah, here's what's going on in the brain. Here's how that happens and why our practice is showing that effect, which is fascinating. So yes, I would very much like to speak with Tim about that.
Yeah.
So, been speaking with Britta Hoelzel from Mass General Hospital, Department of Psychiatry, Division of Psychiatric Neuroscience at Lazar Lab. Britta, thank you so much for being here. I've really appreciated it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at www.secularbuddhistassociation.com, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaisa Neptune CD Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.